Tragedy in the White Mountains. Experienced hiker dies after sudden snowstorm turns deadly. A seasoned hiker from Massachusetts lost his life in a shocking turn of weather conditions after an unexpected snowstorm blanketed parts of New England, highlighting the unpredictable dangers of mountain environment. Now let's dive deeper and explore every layer of this story on our AI
So
podcast.
imagine it's a beautiful Friday, like it's April 17th, and Kent Wood is just standing there in 66-degree weather.
Oh, perfect hiking weather.
Right, he's feeling that warm spring sun on his face, probably feeling totally confident in his weekend plans. But then, just 48 hours later, he froze to death.
Wow.
Yeah. Today, we're doing a deep dive into how a beautiful, mild spring afternoon is actually, well, it's one of the deadliest traps you can encounter in the wilderness.
It really is, and I know it sounds completely counterintuitive. I mean, we're conditioned to fear the dead of winter, right? Like those massive blizzards in January or February.
Exactly. You don't look at a mild April day and think, I'm going to be fighting for my life.
You really don't. But that false sense of security, that's the core of what makes this specific phenomenon so incredibly lethal.
So we're jumping into a stack of sources today, mostly centering around this really sobering news report detailing the tragic death of that hiker up in New Hampshire's White Mountains. And the mission of this deep dive isn't just to, recount what happened.
Right, there's a bigger lesson here.
Yeah, exactly. We are here to unpack the really deceptive illusion of spring mountain weather, to understand the cascading effects of the complacency it breeds, and honestly, to extract vital survival lessons for anyone out there, meaning you, the listener, before you step out into the wilderness.
Because nature fundamentally does not care what month is printed on your calendar.
It really doesn't.
No, it doesn't. And that is why we really need to look for the why behind this tragedy. Because when we review reports like this, from the comfort of our living rooms,
Oh, so easy to judge.
right, the temptation is to just assume we would have checked the weather app more carefully or recognized the danger sooner. But as we comb through these details, we'll see that the environment actually plays incredibly powerful psychological tricks on the human brain.
Yeah, and we really need to analyze the mechanics of those tricks.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this, because the details of how this all unfolded completely challenge my own assumptions about wilderness safety. Well, we're talking about Kent Wood, right? He's a 61-year-old hiker from West Roxbury, Massachusetts. And the source material really emphasizes a critical piece of information here. He was an experienced hiker.
Yes.
This was not some novice who just bought their first pair of boots on a Friday and blindly wandered into the woods on a Saturday.
And that experience factor tells us so much. It tells us that what went wrong was not a lack of basic hiking knowledge. I mean, he knew how to put one foot in front of the other. He knew how to navigate a trail.
Right.
He was actually the victim of a highly specific miscalculation regarding elevation and, well, atmospheric physics.
Okay, so let's walk through the timeline. He sets out for a weekend camping and hiking trip, starting from the Lafayette Campground in Lincoln, New Hampshire. He's heading up into the really rugged trails of Franconia Notch.
Classic spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And down in Lincoln, on that Friday, the temperature reached a very comfortable 66 degrees Fahrenheit.
Nice and warm.
But then, between Sunday and Monday, the temperature up in the mountains plummeted well below freezing, and they got hit with 3 to 5 inches of snow.
Which is a massive swing.
Right. And I just struggle to understand how an experienced hiker ignores freezing winds just because it was warm at their car. Wouldn't the dropping temperature on the hike up be a massive, unavoidable red flag?
You would definitely think so. But you've got to remember, you're experiencing that temperature drop while engaging in strenuous physical activity.
All right, because you're hiking up a steep incline.
Exactly. You're climbing with a heavy pack.
Right.
Your body is generating a massive amount of internal heat. So as that ambient air temperature drops, you might just feel like, you're cooling off nicely from the exertion.
Oh, wow. So you actually feel comfortable.
Yeah, until you stop. By the time you stop to rest or, say, set up camp, that internal furnace basically shuts down, and suddenly you are engulfed in freezing air.
Hey, it's too late.
It is. And it happens much faster than people realize due to something called the adiabatic lapse rate.
The adiabatic lapse rate.
Yeah. Basically, as air is forced up the side of a mountain, it expands and cools rapidly. So you aren't just walking into colder weather. The mountain is actively creating a localized freezing climate right at its peak.
That is wild. I was actually trying to find a way to visualize that extreme contrast for you, the listener, and I realized it's essentially like looking at a large boulder sitting in the middle of a rushing river.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, so down on the riverbank, which is our valley, the water in the shallows is, calm, it's slow, completely manageable. But that boulder, standing up high in the center of the river, it's catching the full violent force of the current with absolutely zero friction to slow it down.
That is a phenomenal way to picture the mechanism of mountain weather. The valley is completely shielded. Meanwhile, the summit is just taking the brunt of the atmosphere.
Right.
And this brings us to the psychological component, which is the anchoring bias.
Anchoring bias.
Yeah. So when you arrive at a trailhead and it's 66 degrees, your brain immediately anchors to that sensory input. Your physical environment, the warmth on your skin, the fact that there's no snow in the parking lot, it creates this powerful cognitive shortcut.
So it tricks you.
It convinces your brain that it is unequivocally spring everywhere.
Okay, so your body is basically giving your brain accurate information for an elevation of 800 feet. But then the brain incorrectly applies that same data to an elevation of 4,000 feet.
Yes, precisely. Your brain just fails to intuitively project how violently that environment will shift once you leave the riverbank and climb up onto the boulder.
That makes so much sense.
You completely lose the mental urgency to prepare for winter because right there at your car, winter feels like a distant memory.
Wow.
The atmosphere is thinner up high. Weather systems move in without any of the friction from surrounding landmasses that you mentioned. So a mild day at the base makes people vastly underestimate how quickly a front can move in at altitude and drop temperatures by 40 degrees or more.
And the really terrifying part is that psychological trap doesn't just get you into trouble. It actively prevents anyone from getting you out.
Absolutely.
Because if you think it's just a pleasant spring weekend, you don't warn your family that you're heading into a winter survival situation.
You don't sound the alarm.
Exactly. And that missing sense of alarm is what makes the timeline of this search and rescue effort so agonizing. Kent Wood's family hadn't heard from him for 2 full days.
2 days in freezing weather.
Yeah. They finally contacted authorities, and on Tuesday, a massive search operation was launched in the Lonesome Lake and Kinsman Pond area.
And we really have to analyze the mechanism of a delayed response in a survival scenario here. Because for 48 hours, temperatures were below freezing and snow was falling.
Which means any tracks are gone.
Exactly. The mountain was essentially wiping away his footprints with fresh snow, meaning the rescue teams had zero geographic starting point.
That's horrifying.
No one was looking for him during those critical first 2 days because no one knew he was in trouble yet.
So when they finally do launch the search, it involves multiple agencies, tons of emergency personnel. They locate his body on Tuesday evening at 7:41 p.m., and he's about 5.5 miles from his parked vehicle.
Right.
But let me push back on this geography for a second, because I want to make sure we grasp the mechanics of a rescue. A distance of 5.5 miles, that's a quick 10-minute drive on the highway, right? A decent runner could cover it on a treadmill in under an hour.
Sure.
Yet the rescue crews couldn't carry his body off the trail until 1:10 a.m. Wednesday morning. Why does moving 5.5 miles take over 5 hours for highly trained professionals?
What's fascinating here is the compounding nature of Alpine emergencies and how terrain mechanics drastically alter our perception of time and distance. I mean, you aren't walking on a flat, paved surface here.
Not at all.
Franconia Notch features notoriously rugged trails. We're talking steep inclines, massive boulders, tangled root systems. Now, take all of that and remove all daylight. Add freezing temperatures. And then cover that highly uneven terrain in 3 to 5 inches of fresh, slippery snow on top of lingering winter ice.
I mean, it just sounds like an obstacle course designed to break ankles.
It essentially is. And then you have to coordinate a team of 6 to 8 people to physically carry a heavy, rigid rescue litter over those obstacles.
You can't just casually stroll down.
No, you cannot just march straight down. You are carefully passing a stretcher over icy boulders in the pitch dark, coordinating every single step so no one slips and causes another casualty. It is exhausting, perilous, incredibly slow work.
To put a point on those exact conditions, there's a quote in the report from New Hampshire Fish and Game Sergeant Christopher McKee.
Oh, yeah, that quote is chilling.
It really is. He stated, quote, "It's 40 degrees at the top and never got above freezing. The trees are still covered in snow, nothing was melting up there, and it was extremely cold."
And that quote just completely shatters the illusion we discussed earlier. Down below, spring is blooming. Up top, it is a static, frozen, hostile environment.
It's a completely different world.
And think about it. If a fully equipped rescue team working in relays with specialized gear struggles this profoundly just to navigate back to the trailhead, we can deduce the impossible odds facing a solo hiker caught in the teeth of that same storm.
Right.
The margin for error is effectively zero.
Which is terrifying. And, you would assume an event like this is a rare freak occurrence, like just a tragic combination of bad luck and timing for one person.
You'd hope so.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The source material zooms out and reveals a massive systemic blind spot in how people approach wilderness recreation.
Yes, the other rescues.
Right. During the exact same week that Kent Wood lost his life, local reports indicated that 6 other hikers from Massachusetts had to be rescued in the White Mountains due to changing conditions.
Yeah.
6 other people in 1 week.
It's staggering. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we are looking at a psychological epidemic, not an isolated incident.
An epidemic.
Yes. The reports also highlight a fatality earlier in the year where a climber died on Mount Whitney in California, stranded during hazardous winter conditions. This reveals a fundamental flaw in human risk assessment.
Okay, let's dig into that flaw. Because New Hampshire Fish and Game issued a blunt warning, practically shouting from the rooftops that it was, quote, still winter in the mountains with deep snow and freezing temperatures.
They were very clear.
So why didn't these hikers heed that warning? Why doesn't the brain update its firmware, so to speak, when the trail starts getting icy and the wind picks up?
It really comes down to cognitive load and how our brains utilize heuristics.
I feel like mental shortcuts, right?
Exactly. Processing every single variable in a new environment takes a massive amount of caloric energy. To save energy, our brains rely on pattern recognition. The shortcut dictates that the calendar month of April equals spring, and a local weather app showing mild temperatures equals safety.
So the brain categorizes the entire trip as low risk before they even leave their driveway.
Exactly the issue. Consider where these specific hikers were traveling from. The report noted they traveled from Massachusetts up to New Hampshire.
Right.
They left an environment that was already deeply into spring. The grass was green, the trees were budding. They drove a couple of hours north in a climate-controlled car. They stepped out into 66-degree air.
So everything is confirming their bias.
Yes. Every piece of sensory data they gathered for the previous 48 hours reinforced the heuristic that winter was over.
Even when the evidence actively changes on the mountain, they're just locked in.
Yeah, because of cognitive dissonance and commitment bias, you've probably heard of the sunk cost fallacy.
Oh, right, where you feel like you've invested too much to turn back.
Exactly. You've driven 2 hours, you've packed all your gear, you've hiked 3 miles up this steep trail. When the temperature starts dropping, acknowledging the danger means admitting your initial assessment was wrong and abandoning the goal you invested all that time into.
Nobody likes doing that.
No, it takes a conscious, genuinely difficult effort of critical thinking to override all of that previous sensory input and decide to just turn around.
Okay, so what does this all mean for us? For you, the listener, who might be planning a hike or venturing into any unpredictable environment anytime soon.
We need practical takeaways.
Exactly. The authorities transition from diagnosing this psychological problem to providing a specific survival blueprint. And I want us to look at this not just as a packing list, but by examining the actual mechanisms of survival.
I love that approach.
So they mandate proper gear, starting with waterproof boots.
Right. The mechanism of a waterproof boot is all about preventing thermal bridging.
Thermal bridging.
Yeah, so if you hike in porous sneakers, right, and you hit 3 inches of snow, that moisture instantly penetrates to your socks. And water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air.
Oh, wow. 25 times.
Yeah, so within minutes, the heat from your feet is being aggressively siphoned away into the frozen ground.
And once your extremities get cold, your core temperature drops.
Yeah.
And that leads to frostbite and hypothermia.
Exactly.
Okay, the next item they list is warm, layered clothing. Now, we hear about layers all the time, but why is layering specifically better than just bringing one massive winter coat?
Because layering works on the principle of trapping microclimates of dead air.
Microclimates.
Yeah, your base layer pulls sweat away from your skin so you don't freeze from your own moisture. Then the middle layers trap the heat your body generates in small pockets of air. And finally, the outer shell blocks the wind from blowing that trapped heat away.
Ah, so it's a whole system.
It is. And you can micro-adjust these layers so you don't sweat on the way up, but you still have insulation when the temperature drops 40 degrees at the summit.
That is brilliant. Okay, they also emphasize emergency shelter, and I think people might picture carrying like a heavy canvas tent, but we're really talking about an emergency bivy sack or a thermal space blanket here, right?
Right. And the physics behind an emergency blanket is radiant heat reflection.
How does that work?
Well, if you twist an ankle and have to stop moving, your internal furnace shuts down, like we talked about earlier. You are no longer generating new heat. A space blanket reflects your remaining body heat back toward you rather than letting it escape into the atmosphere.
So it buys you time.
Exactly. It buys you the most valuable resource in a rescue scenario. Time.
Makes total sense. They also list extra food and water, naturally, and navigation tools. Now, the navigation piece feels crucial because, as you mentioned, snow instantly covers up trail markers.
Instantly.
But I imagine pulling out a smartphone to check a digital map isn't always super reliable in those conditions.
No, cold weather absolutely decimates the chemical reactions inside lithium-ion batteries.
Really? That fast?
Oh, yeah. A smartphone that has a 70% charge at the trailhead can literally drop to 0% in 10 minutes when exposed to freezing winds.
That is terrifying if it's your only map.
It's why you must have analog navigation, like a physical map and compass, or you have to keep your electronic devices heavily insulated close to your body heat.
Wow. Which actually perfectly transitions into the final and perhaps most vital components of the survival blueprint. The authorities insist you must bring communication devices. But more importantly, you must inform family or friends about your specific hiking plans, your exact routes, and your expected return times.
This is the big one.
Yeah, break down the logistics of this communication strategy for us because it feels like the one step people constantly skip.
It really is, and it's the most critical piece of the puzzle. Plus, it requires zero physical weight in your backpack.
Right.
In search and rescue operations, everything revolves around this concept of the last known point, or LKP.
Okay, so how does the LKP dictate the search?
Well, if you do not leave a detailed itinerary, your last known point is just your parked car.
Ooh.
Right. And the search radius expands geometrically from that car based on how fast a person can walk. So within a few hours, rescuers are looking at a search area of potentially dozens of square miles. They are forced to comb through the wilderness completely blind.
It turns into a total needle in a haystack scenario, which completely explains that 2-day gap before Kent Wood was found.
Exactly. Conversely, if you leave a rigid itinerary telling someone, hey, I am taking the Falling Waters Trail to the ridge and I will text you by 6 p.m. If you don't hear from me by 8 p.m., call the authorities. You alter the entire math of the rescue.
Because they know exactly where to look.
Yes. Your last known point becomes a specific, narrow trail corridor. Search teams know exactly where to deploy their resources. You drastically reduce your rescue timeline before you even leave your house.
That is so powerful.
Knowledge is really only valuable when it is understood and applied in this manner.
So to quickly summarize the journey of our deep dive today for you listening, we started by looking at a deceptively beautiful 66-degree spring day down in the valley. We explored the atmospheric physics and that tricky anchoring bias that trapped a highly experienced hiker in a sudden freezing snowstorm at elevation. We examined the brutal, exhausting reality of alpine rescues, where carrying a litter over rugged terrain means moving 5.5 miles takes over 5 hours. We saw that this is a widespread, systemic psychological blind spot that caught 6 other people in the same week. And finally, we broke down the actual physics of survival gear and the critical mathematics of the last known point.
It really always returns to recognizing the limits of our perception. We have to prepare for the reality of the environment we are entering, not the comfortable environment we are leaving behind.
Because nature does not care what the thermometer in the valley says.
It doesn't. And you know, this raises an important question, one that I think extends far beyond the tree line of the White Mountains.
What's that?
Well, the spring weather illusion trapped these hikers because they trusted their immediate, comfortable surroundings over the harsher, unseen reality ahead of them. So where else in our life, in our business strategies, in our relationships, or in our long-term personal planning, do we let a comfortable, easy valley blind us to the inevitable storms that are waiting at the summit?
Wow. That is a phenomenal question to ponder. It is so incredibly easy to mistake a clear day right now for a clear path tomorrow. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay prepared, and we will catch you next time.
Okay, one question for you. Should popular hiking destinations require mandatory registration, GPS tracking, or check-in systems to improve rescue chances during sudden weather disasters? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.